customer helpful than compared to predictive life cycles. In case of iterative and incremental life cycles, an iteration repeats the same set of phases in a cycle, while an increment is concerned with adding more functionality or elaborating the project's deliverables. So we are talking about two terms here. One is iteration, then increment. An iteration repeats the same set of phases in a cycle, while an increment is concerned with adding more functionality or elaborating the project's deliverable. So iteration, you have a set of phases, you repeat that, you get a deliverable out. Now the next iteration or the next increment, you follow the same iteration, but then you have another set of features added at the end of that particular increment. So these are called incremental and iterative life cycle, which is characteristic of adaptive life cycles. Okay, now when you look at the project life cycle, your project starts, you have a feasibility study, then you gather requirements. Once your feasibility study is successful, then you design, you develop, you test, and you deploy. So understandably, your cost and staffing levels peak during project execution phase. Once you have planned, you have designed, and you are developing things, that is the time when you will use a lot of resources. When you use a lot of resources, a lot of cost is spent, because you spend cost on procuring those resources on board, the project team on board. So cost and staffing levels peak during project execution phase. Risk and uncertainty are greatest at the start of the project. So obviously when you start the project, the customer is not sure what he's going to get. Although you have experience, you have done previous projects, there is always an uncertainty because you don't have anything on hand. There is this fear that whether you can complete things successfully. So risk and uncertainty are high at the start of the project phase or at the start of the project life cycle. Cost and staffing levels peak during project execution. Cost of making changes increases as project reaches completion. Initially, when you're gathering requirements, it's easy to factor everything into your requirement document, but then once you know what is your requirement, you have procured the needed resources and you have done all the work, and when your project gets into the execution phase and it's about to be delivered tomorrow, and today when the client wants a change on the requirements, it's really tough because you have to revisit everything in terms of getting the necessary resources, looking at the cost, revisiting all the constraints, objectives. So that's why as your project elapses or as your project nears completion, cost of making changes is higher, and the risk is higher during the start of the project. And also the ability for the customer to influence on the project requirements is high in the initial phases, while the project team or the performing organization has an upper hand towards the project end. Here when I say the ability of stakeholders to influence the project outcomes is higher in the beginning, here the stakeholders means the actual customers who are the key stakeholders. Adaptive life cycles. Now what is adaptive life cycle? Let's recap. Predictive life cycle is waterfall, adaptive life cycle is iterative and incremental. So okay, let's go ahead. Adaptive life cycles are followed to keep the stakeholder influences higher and the cost of change is lower. This is the reason the stakeholders can obviously include their changes or the requirements as part of the next increment or iteration. Which one is this? This is increment, because iteration is phases, increment is addition of new features. So adaptive life cycles are followed to keep the stakeholder influences higher and cost of changes lower. Even if they miss something in this particular increment or particular set of requirements, something in the set of requirements, they can obviously include in the next sprint or Next, increment. Face-to-face relationships. So we know that the project has a life cycle. The life cycle is split into phases. Now again, the project life cycle can be handled in a, it can be called adaptive life cycle, predictive life cycle. Now